All right, I'll go ahead and kick this off. Um, Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Michael Taylor. I'm product manager at SafeGraph. SafeGraph is a geospatial data company. And thanks for joining today and for listening along. We're going to discuss places data and specifically maintaining quality places data and everything that entails. So we've got a pretty straightforward agenda here. I'll start with just a brief overview of SafeGraph and what we do, just so that you can understand why we need to be talking about this subject. From there, I'll dig into quality places data, what that actually means and what it takes. Towards the end, we'll cover why quality data matters by taking a look at places data in action. And finally, we'll wrap up with plenty of time for Q&A. Okay, so about SafeGraph, for those who may be less familiar with us, we are a data company and just a data company. By that, we mean we focus all of our energy on high quality, reliable places data. And for us, a place is anywhere on the globe with a location. Restaurants, stores, malls, libraries, hospitals, distribution centers, bus stops, national parks, the list goes on and on. And as part of our fundamental places offering, what we've listed there on the left, we capture and deliver descriptive details about these locations. And as I said, these places span the globe and they make up kind of the rows in our database. From there, we have additional products that layer on additional columns where applicable and provide even more detail and context. So we've got our geometry offering, which includes actual polygons for each place, along with some metadata about those places are physically related to each other. Our patterns data sets layer anonymized mobility data on top of our polygons to help us understand foot traffic and consumer behavior at the individual place level. And our spend offering aggregates anonymized transaction data, again, to provide more context into how consumers are spending money at these individual locations. So a brief overview on SafeGraph, but today we're focusing on, within our ecosystem, what we would consider to be places data specifically. And not necessarily our places data or SafeGraph places data, but places data in general. And we're talking about it because it's the foundation of all the other types of geolocation data. Everything anchors back to the physical locations. For us, like I mentioned earlier, it's simplest to think about this as the rows in our database. So the number of stores or the number of restaurants, schools, airports, et cetera. And then from there, you can obviously add on additional columns that provide more and more rich context. But if the rows aren't accurate, if those place listings aren't accurate, the rest of it all breaks down. And I guess before we get too far, I just want to be very explicit about what I mean by places data when I'm saying it. The most illustrative way we can do that is just to show a snippet of our schema, again, for SafeGraph places. We as a company are on a mission to capture every physical place on the globe, at least at the moment, that isn't a single family home. And our product's essentially a listing for each place with key descriptive information. What do we mean by key descriptive information? We're talking about the address and the geocodes, any brand affiliation, industry codes and categorizations, or any other kind of descriptive categorization. This could expand to things like open hours and phone numbers where applicable. And certainly importantly, the opened on and closed on dates for the place. And we'll cover a lot of this in more detail later, but when did this business or place first open its doors? Or when was it recently shuttered? Again, a descriptive way of saying what we mean by places data. It's this type of data that I'll be referring to when I say that. And again, not just SafeGraph places data, there are plenty of data providers out there. But everything we covered today will be about curating a list of places and the fundamental details about those places. Also, just for the sake of clarity, this is not necessarily business registration data. This is places data, and I think there's an important difference there in that we're actively screening for actual destinations. Business registries can include any and all types of businesses, no matter their kind of relationship to the physical world, right? Etsy stores registered to someone's personal address, or a general contractor who doesn't actually have an office, or a consultant with a PO box. All definitely valid businesses, to be sure, but not places you're going to plot on a map or identify for site selection or urban planning or anything like that. So be sure just when you're looking at places data and you're talking about this, that we're comparing apples to apples when looking at the different lists, and know which data you're ultimately interested in. This is why you'll so commonly hear places referred to as POIs, or points of interest, because someone has to actually be interested in showing up. So with that, we've kind of set the context for what places data is. But now we want to talk about quality of a places data set. So when talking about quality, the terms accuracy and precision get thrown around very often. Everyone's striving for accuracy and precision, and oftentimes they're used interchangeably, but in reality, they're really not the same. Accuracy is a measure of accuracy is a measure relative to a truth set, whereas precision is more a measure of comparability. So we can think of a single location or a place being accurate. Say perhaps the lat long is very close to reflecting the true location of the building. But then repeatedly generating accurate measurements across numerous locations, across numerous timeframes is a better reflection of precision. So in a sense, we can think of accuracy as perhaps creating a quality places data set, and then precision as effectively maintaining a quality places data set. So it's important to keep those two vectors in mind as we discuss quality, because quality for places data is really about routinely hitting a moving target. In any given moment, the data set needs to be reflective of the true details about a place, but it must also stay reflective of the true details about a place, which are constantly changing. We monitor the number of openings and closings we see among our places data, and we publish this list on our public statistics page. Recently, we've been seeing 1,000 brands a month with at least one store opening and 1,000 brands a month with at least one store closing. And for those that are just operating business as usual, they can change names or they can rebrand. One chain may acquire another chain, which could have a broad impact on those businesses, or it could possibly have zero impact. More so just highlighting that to say that you can't treat every acquisition the same. Or there can be more subtle changes to the way businesses operate, whether it's operating hours or phone numbers or whatnot. So obviously staying on top of this is a lot of work. And here are some of the things that we need to consider when we're thinking about maintaining quality places as we're doing that work to stay on top of reflecting an accurate truth. All data sources are going to be different. They're going to have different focuses, they're going to have different use cases, but they'll all need to grapple in some way with these aspects of places complexity. Everything from the update cadence to the approach to different geographic regions. And this is just a highlight, this is the agenda. We're going to hit on each of these in more detail now. So we'll start first up with the most obvious. It's critical to get the places data right. And that's hard. It's important to remember there really is no readily available truth set for places data. If there was, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We would all just be referencing that truth set, case closed. But because it doesn't exist, those compiling places data need to overcome these common challenges in presenting accurate data. So we could do a whole presentation on the difficulties in address normalization. I've actually seen whole presentations on address normalization. So I'll just reiterate that it's hard for the time being, even within a single geography. And it's important to determine how this hurdle is cleared within any given data set. And what I mean by that is just the handling of street names and abbreviations and numbers and suite identification and basically just all the components that live within an address. Not everyone writes them down the same. You know, is boulevard, or is it BBLD? Do you include punctuation? Do you not include punctuation? It's not always the same. And having to handle that, clean that up, and make sure it's presented appropriately is a key hurdle. For geocoding, note that there can be a wide range of sources for this information and a range of approaches as well. So some work better than others depending on the use case. For example, some will geocode a location onto a nearby street, right? So you've got an address and the geolocation or the lat long provided for it actually lands in the middle of the street. That may be great for a transit use case because ultimately you are trying to get to the middle of the street, but not necessarily for mapping. So important to keep in mind kind of what the approach is and ultimately what the outcome is for those geocodes. And then above all else is each entry in the data set, say you've cleared and the addresses and you provided them and you've geocoded everything, but is each address valid? Is each data point valid? How can we be sure that a given place is only represented once? This can be especially problematic when curating multiple input sources, and part of the reason, actually, that we work to co-found PlaceKey, which we provided out as a universal places identifier, because deduplicating a data set is a very key hurdle. And then, is the entry an actual place once you've confirmed it's only in there once? And this gets back a little bit to the earlier commentary on business registration data versus places data. Right, for a places data set, are the at-home businesses or the PO boxes and whatnot, are they all filtered out of the data set? Meaning, is each row really a location you'd actually visit? And finally, how can we be sure the location is still open? Right, if we were to visit, if we were inclined to visit, could we, or has it closed? And that last point, really on open-close tracking, is a challenge into itself. And what I had originally earlier listed as tracking change metrics and kind of the topics we're covering. This is just an example of how SafeGraph monitors and represents when places open and close. But generalized beyond just this metric of an open date and a closed date, it's important that quality places data includes some metric that measures change over time, right? So just because an entry is included doesn't mean that it's still valid. And even for something that is no longer valid, you're going to want to have a stamp for when in time that place was valid. And important, certainly for the accuracy of the places data, obviously you want your list to reflect reality. But especially important as you start to consider what you're going to do with your places data. Are you going to start layering on other data elements from other sources, right? So if you're talking about including, like for us, we have spend for transaction data, or we have patterns for foot traffic data. If you're going to start taking that data and layering it onto your places data, it's critical that you understand kind of the lifeline or the lifespan of any individual row that represents a place. But certainly just measuring open and closed, right? The presence of an opened and closed column certainly can't tell you everything about how recently a data set was updated. Which kind of brings us to the next challenge, which is keeping a data set fresh. This is equally important as getting it right and equally challenging. The best data sets continue to grow, not only through the organic growth of new places within their existing coverage, right? The opening of new restaurants, but also by growing to cover new types of places. Just as a tangible example, for us, last year we added transit POIs to the types of places we cover, right? So we're talking about bus stops or train stations or subway stops. But in that same release, we also increased the number of stores and restaurants, which are types of places that we've always covered, just in continuing to kind of expand scope and find new areas to review. So that meant a lot of new rows. Yay, fantastic. But each time you introduce new variables, you complicate that earlier kind of equation on accuracy. So how do you keep them deduped? How do you geocode them all if they're from a new place? How do you deal with conflicting sources that might be providing conflicting data about a given point, a given place? How resource intensive and error prone is this entire update process? This is often why you'll see data sets that don't update very frequently. Oftentimes quarterly, or even in some cases annually. It's because it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of time and effort and resources, and it introduces a lot of room for error. So in that sense, the fewer updates, the better, right? There's less room for error, kind of you've blessed a specific set of data. But now what about all those openings and closings that we were just talking about? If you remember earlier, I mentioned we're seeing thousands of brands with at least an opening or a closing each month. So when do those updates get reflected in the data set if we're not updating frequently? So just from that alone, just on the brand openings and closings, you can see how quickly data can go stale. Even specifically places data. I think there's oftentimes a bit of a misnomer in the marketplace that once you have the places data, how frequently does it really update? Like how often are there new stores? Well, like very frequently, frankly, is what the data is telling us. So it's a definite tug of war between the work required to update the data sets, right? That the resource intensive, the processing, the error checking, and the need for fresh data. At SafeGraph, just as an example, we update our places data set monthly to ensure it's never too far behind reality, right? Those openings and those closings, while also giving ourselves enough room to meaningfully grow and improve that data set each time, while also giving ourselves enough room to check and limit the errors. And so now to talk about sources. So first of all, a curated places data set really isn't curated if it's not compiling multiple sources. As I mentioned earlier, there's no one source for places truth. And even the large places providers are sourcing in some way, shape, or form themselves. So we've got that as a starting point. But once we've managed to consolidate and dedupe and present our curated places data, how can we ensure its quality? What other data elements might help us get even better? And that's where these types of sources that we've got listed on this slide kind of come into play. We can cross-check what we have against these other kind of sources or areas of truth. And not just as we do the analysis of site selection or urban planning, but even before that. So can say transactions data or foot traffic data help us better understand that a POI is closed, right? So it'd be pretty suspect if all of a sudden the dollars and the transactions stopped flowing into a specific retailer or restaurant or coffee shop. Same with foot traffic, if all of a sudden no one's entering kind of the defined space for that POI. Can satellite imagery help us determine that a place has changed in shape and therefore maybe an entirely new place, right? They have a new polygon wicket that we're being defined. Or perhaps that a certain building no longer even exists and is now just an empty lot as far as satellite imagery is concerned. Certainly there's AI modeling that can help us spot anomalies or help us with the spot checking even. A lot of these patterns within a data set that a human eye wouldn't necessarily find or contribute. But then sometimes there really is no substitute for kind of the human element in this places equation, right? So in some areas, I shouldn't say manually, getting someone on the streets and actually reviewing what is there and curating that data, whether it's to review the data set that we've already curated or just to continue to add to it. Sometimes there's just no replacement for actual boots on the ground. And of course, we can and will mix and match if we're putting together a quality places data set. So there can be manual review of satellite imagery to gut check the AI modeling output, right? The more and more combos that can be added to a production workflow, the more quality the output will be, and oftentimes the less error will be included once it finally reaches the end of the pipeline. And then finally, at least with regard to the quality component of this conversation. So finally, you may or may not have noticed that I haven't once said anything about international in any of these last few slides, right? So perhaps you were applying that lens yourself, but everything I've covered thus far can apply even within a small specified region. So SafeGraph started building out our places data set in the United States and had to overcome all of these things before we ever expanded into Canada, which was the second country that we curated a places data set for. And now we're looking at over 200 countries and territories around the world. And every time you cross into a new border or expand into a new region, it comes with a new set of variables for that quality equation we've kind of been tracking. So a few of those variables. One, of course, language. You have to consider language, which is hard enough when you're talking about different places, but as you get into more places that are probably a little bit farther from home, you have different character alphabets. How do you handle those? They can certainly wreak havoc on the way that the databases try and process this type of information. Different regions and countries also have their own unique address formatting, and that needs to be consolidated into a common schema. This can take the shape of extra components within an address, different ordering of those components, and it can even get a little bit more tricky if the regional hierarchies don't align. And what I mean by regional hierarchy is the relationship between cities and states and countries. What if they don't line up? What if one area happens to have an extra layer of identification? Or how do you make sure you map census block groups in the US to dissemination areas in Canada? Getting all of those things to line up can be really tough sometimes to find apples to apples. And then even if you get the logistical part right, so you've managed to handle the languages, you've managed to handle the addresses, then you can get businesses themselves, which will represent or will present themselves differently in different areas. Some may only operate in specific locales. That's not uncommon. Others may operate in one locale by one name and a different name in a different place, even if they all eventually roll up to the same kind of corporate mothership. Think of an example in the US is Carl's Jr. versus Hardee's, or Burger King and Hungry Jack's across borders. Once you've got all of that ironed out, then start back at the top of this challenges list and work back through the deduping and normalizing and updating, etc. Okay, so I'm gonna pause and shift gears here a bit. We've talked about accuracy and precision to this point, the curation and maintenance of quality data. But let's now shift a bit to kind of show why that entire process matters. I'm going to run through a few representative case studies, if you will. All of them are based on our own experiences with customers of all kinds and prospects, different situations. A lot of them are blended of similar type customers, but I think ultimately the premise here is that you'll find them representative for why quality data matters and why we shouldn't take shortcuts. So just one to hit off the top is retail site selection. So West Coast Coffee Company, regional coffee shop, like any retail business, the placement of their shops is critical. A lot of people don't really necessarily consider that a misplaced store, like the mistake of not closing the right store or not placing the next store in the right area is something that can be extremely expensive, far more expensive than a lot of the costs associated with obtaining quality data. So that's a trade-off equation that I don't think gets enough focus. This West Coast Coffee Company, like they'll purchase places data to better understand the mix of businesses in a given area. Where are the competing coffee shops? Where are the competing QSRs, like a McDonald's who also sells coffee and maybe kind of a dent in their competitive market? Are there complementary brands nearby or store types nearby? Like do their stores do really well by Lululemon or something to that effect? And then certainly just the general success of an area, like are the businesses seeing success where you want to consider opening or closing a coffee shop? Are other coffee shops opening and closing? In general, are businesses opening and closing, even if they aren't specifically kind of within the competitive realm? Quality is key here because the industries and profiles of all the relevant stores they certainly matter significantly. And stale data can really lead to those expensive mistakes. Whether it's West Coast Coffee Co. or any other retailer, they need to operate off an accurate reality when the open stores are open and the closed stores are closed. And then also just for each of these is almost more of a minor footnote. I'll mention just a couple other data sets that can kind of take this to the next level. So what you would do to layer on to places data for kind of a positive output. So in this case for site selection, certainly adding something like transaction data or foot traffic data would be meaningful and helpful in retail site selection. in not only knowing where the coffee shops are, right, but where the popular coffee shops or are, some of these coffee shops above or below kind of a regional average or a national average. So I'll hit on those kind of the extra data sets or the potentially complementary data sets here, but I think in a lot of circumstances, they'll be pretty self-evident. All right, so international retail site selection. Global Coffee Co. is an international coffee company. They may have started in the United States, but they've certainly turned their success across borders, and they're continually looking to expand their markets. They buy places data for exactly the same reason as what I said on the last slide, so I won't repeat it all here. This is more just meant to be kind of representative of the same situation, which can scale. And it can scale up or down, and it's still illustrative of why you need quality places data. It's just really helpful if that places data is common in all of those marketplaces, right? So instead of getting places data from one source in one area and another source in another area, if you can solve them from the same source, you don't have to worry about a lot of the consistency issues that you might find of matching data across sources. And of course, back to the original point, mistakes can be expensive, so the data needs to be accurate. Another use case, right? So those who are doing geospatial analysis or just mapping. Maps on Maps Inc. is a global mapping solution used by millions of people. This application is extremely popular. The users expect, quote, everything just to be there, which is always fun in software and data in general. Whether that's for directions, nearby restaurants, what have you. Someone in this industry is going to purchase places data because they need to put things on the map. They need a location name, they need a geocode, and obviously they're going to be stitching together a lot of different sources to provide a lot of this stuff. But also, once those points and pins are on the map, like what are they? Are they pizza restaurants? Are they clothing stores? Is it a public park? How can I contact them if I need to? Or when should I show up if I want to visit? As is the case with a lot of the things we're going to run into, it's open and closed is again crucial because the map needs to be accurate, right? If the place is no longer there, it should be removed from the map or it should be rolled over to reflect the new store or business that is operating kind of in that space. Of course, quality is key here because people are making decisions based on this input. They're trying to arrive at a store that is currently present and wasn't present last year. It's currently present and hasn't closed. And obviously, if a map can't provide that, then the map isn't going to provide the utility that its users need. As a tack on here, geometry could certainly be something that you expend to this, or so geometry in the sense that you may want to actually outline the buildings themselves, draw the polygon on the map so that people can understand where it is. But then if you actually want to add additional metadata like popularity or something to that effect, then you could even expand beyond just the geometry. I've got listed here to patterns or spend, again, in more broad parlance, the foot traffic and transactions data. Urban planning for local governments. We like to think of Graph City sometimes as an example of kind of a place that is worried about urban planning, worried about optimizing for local businesses as well as residents. They want to make sure everyone, kind of all of their constituents, has access to the appropriate amenities. The businesses have access to what they need. The consumers have access to what they need. That the city itself is effectively thriving. They purchase places data to assess the business mix in different districts, right? You've got downtowns versus suburbs. You've got general trends, right? Are businesses opening in a particular area versus another area? Yes, cities have their own data. They have their own business registries, but a lot of times this is most meaningful when you're comparing it to a different city, potentially a city that you think is doing well, or just the average that people expect from, air quotes, cities. That requires information that isn't on necessarily just Graph City in this case, but maybe on the surrounding region as well. So apply that mix here, or kind of that context to any of these bullets. Just to hit a few others, potential transit deserts. So are there enough transit stops or transit services? Same for food deserts. Are there enough grocery stores? Access to healthcare is huge. Are those services broadly placed? Are they over anchored to the areas with dense population and perhaps less anchored to the areas with less? dense population. Presence and dispersion of green space, right? Is there enough parks? Are there enough parks and areas like that for all of the people? If you invest in parks, are you seeing kind of people using it, right? And that's where adding on something like foot traffic would make sense. And then last point there, just the impact of manufacturing, right? So the distribution, a lot of the industrial facilities that operate and help businesses go, like where are those locations placed? Are they near people, right? Are they near suburbs? Are they near high population density places? Are they away from downtown? Are they impacting traffic? All of those types of variables. Again, quality is key here because the people are making decisions based on this data. And the data impacts a large number of people. Freshness is key. So, you know, the update cadence is key here. Because if these past couple of years have taught us anything, it's that a lot can change in a short period of time. Some cities are seeing massive increases in population. Others are seeing drawbacks in population. How is that impacting the infrastructure? An accurate representation of the physical world is necessary to find what is and isn't working and obviously make the appropriate adjustments. To pivot to another industry, advertising and visit attribution. So, you know, Graph Media is an out-of-home advertiser. The use case for the vast majority of the advertising industry is context, right? Is the place that I'm putting, is the placement of my ad correct? And is it having the desired effect? Advertising agencies oftentimes have the GPS pings. Then they need places data to understand the context around those GPS pings, right? So where are the places? Is it near a convenience store? Is it near a restaurant? Obviously layering on geometry and the polygons takes us to a whole nother level, but you still want to know if that polygon is a coffee shop or a pizza restaurant or a men's clothing outlet. The things on the map have to be accurate. And advertising is very, very interested in the performance, or I should say the near-term performance of their ads, right? So we're not talking about finding out, you know, 3 months later that a certain store closed and therefore isn't somehow impacting kind of the equation of the performance of this specific ad. They want to talk about it, if not weekly, that it's nightly. So it's critical that the places data that they're referencing is as up to date as possible. And one other just kind of variable to add on top of this is spend, kind of like the transaction data can be very helpful in understanding where to run campaigns. So maybe not necessarily the performance of a campaign itself, but knowing that a specific area, a specific coffee shop, a specific region in their QSRs would be primed for an ad, a specific advertising campaign, because it fits some kind of a growth threshold or a kind of a popular area, a hot area with regard to the way that consumers are spending their money. I'm going to speed up a little bit here as I head towards the end. I hope this isn't getting too repetitive, but certainly I think the premise around quality data is certainly important. Real estate investment, so there's just another angle. Shopping Consolidators LLC is a commercial real estate firm. They specialize in the shopping centers, in purchasing and owning shopping centers. So they serve as both kind of an investment portfolio as well as a tenant. They constantly have to make decisions as to whether or not to continue to own, divest, or purchase new shopping centers. And obviously places data is critical because they're buying places. Now, they may have some first-party data on their own shopping centers, but they certainly are going to want to understand the surrounding area. Where are other competing potential places with regard to their tenant mix? What's the turnover in a given area, right? Is there turnover above or below kind of the air quote market? And then certainly as they're choosing where to invest in new places, they're going to want to be able to kind of create a profile around any given area, around any given shopping center. Part of that's going to be the tenants that exist in it. A huge part of that are going to be the tenants that exist in a lot of other areas surrounding it. Quality places data, key here, again, because of investment decisions. People making decisions, you never want to lose money based on bad inputs and bad data. Insurance, risk assessment. Midwest Mutuals, a regional insurance company specializing in commercial risk and liability. They're writing policies to businesses to protect for slip, trip, and fall. They need to maintain a viable loss ratio. Because they're a regionally focused firm, their margins are even tighter than those potentially of a larger, more national firm, right? They've got fewer policies written, which means a mistake on any given policy can be even more detrimental. So what they need to know is effectively about any given policy holder, whether it's the policy holder themselves or just the general area around said policy holder. What details can be provided that help them understand whether or not this specific business that they're operating with is outside of the norm, right? Insurance companies are often looking at outliers. Their statistical models are based on averages. So when are the specific policy that they're looking at not part of kind of that average? So in this case, there's some major basics around just address normalization, right? So you can obtain places data, which will give you a much better feel for consistent addresses, so that anyone that walks in as a policyholder, you know exactly what you're talking about, you know exactly the address and the format that it is. Does the industry categorization that the places data set provide map up with what the tenant provider is saying, right? If they say they're a pizza shop, are they a pizza shop? If they say they aren't a bar, do they have opening hours that would suggest potentially otherwise? And other things like square footage, right? Is what's the size of this particular place, and does that equate to potentially an increased risk? The other angle here that's oftentimes very specific to insurance companies is just the whether it's a risky co-tenant, if you're talking about like someone within a shopping mall or just any given place, like what are the neighboring POI? We use an example oftentimes, like you may be insuring, a nail salon or a business that sells greeting cards or something that's not that risky in and of itself. But if that place is next to a fireworks factory, well, then you have a much higher risk than the average, say, stationary shop. So again, just angles that places data can help. And this is the last one that we'll wrap up on. Consumer packaged goods and kind of the lead gen. So the Fizzy Bottle Co. Sells a wide variety of soda and other soft drinks to multiple markets. Distribution is critical, highly competitive area. They need to get their products to market efficiently and in a robust manner. They buy places data mostly to understand where the potential outlets are for selling their goods, right? So where are the convenience stores? Where are the restaurants? Where are the 7-Elevens of the world? Are these, can they find pockets of these stores that are opening at a high rate? Can they avoid pockets of these stores that are closing at a high rate? Can they prioritize where they, based on that information, can they prioritize where their sales force is working and focusing? Whether it's making phone calls or making on-visit trips to try and get their products into more and more distribution places. And then finally, outside of even just the list of potential places to sell their products, looking at the kind of the distribution network behind it. So manufacturing facilities, distribution centers, the warehouses, things of that nature. Where are those? How can they be, better utilized within kind of the supply chain to understand how they can more efficiently, get these products to market. Quality data is key here because margins can be so thin in this industry, and because of the competitive, just the over competitive space, you need to take advantage of any competitive advantage you can. And the ability to flag expanding or contracting growth ahead of time can mean a ton. Again, I'll wrap it there. Apologies if perhaps the last couple of slides were a little bit more repetitive. Again, I think it probably made the point on the necessity of quality places data, and the quality places data isn't quality unless it's updated. So I'll say thank you for listening and for putting up with the kind of a blip there in the middle. I've used SafeGraph Places as a representative data set throughout this presentation today. So if you're interested in learning more about what we offer, you can visit our website. It's at safegraph.com/places. And then I'd be happy to take a couple minutes to answer any questions if there are any. Feel free to drop them in the chat or in Q&A. Thanks again.